The bedrock principle of American constitutional governance rests on the separation of powers and the rule of law, the idea that executive actions must operate within defined legal boundaries, that international agreements demand good faith negotiation, and that economic policy cannot be wielded as a weapon of personal grievance. These aren't abstract concepts debated in law schools. They're the guardrails that prevent autocratic impulse from destroying the very economic foundations that generations of Americans built through painstaking diplomacy and strategic partnership. What unfolded in the last 48 hours represents not just a violation of these principles, but their complete inversion. Mexico has formally withdrawn from what trade analysts were calling the North American Manufacturing Integration Agreement, a $940 billion framework negotiating since late 2024 that would have locked in automotive, electronics, and aerospace production partnerships for the next 15 years. This wasn't a trade deal in the traditional sense. This was the architecture of North American economic integration, the kind of foundational commitment that takes decades to build and seconds to destroy. Wall Street's response was immediate and catastrophic. In overnight trading and through Tuesday's session, U.S. equity markets hemorrhaged over $80 billion in value. The S&P 500 collapsed too, 1% in its worst single-day performance since October. The Dow plunged 870 points. The Nasdaq, heavily weighted toward tech companies that depend on cross-border supply chains, dropped 561 points as major investors fled to gold and silver in a flight to safety not seen since the worst days of pandemic uncertainty. This isn't market volatility. This is a crisis of confidence in American economic leadership. And here's what makes this moment so dangerous. This was entirely predictable, entirely preventable, and entirely the result of one man's inability to understand that trade policy is not a reality television negotiation, where you can threaten your way to victory and then walk it back when the cameras stop rolling. The timeline of how we arrived at this catastrophic moment reveals a pattern of reckless governance that constitutional scholars are now openly comparing to the kind of executive overreach that led to Nixon's downfall. On January 20th, President Trump announced tariffs targeting 8 NATO allies over Greenland. Markets dropped precipitously. On February 1st, he imposed 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, citing border security and fentanyl, legal justifications so tenuous that former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner described them as stretching International Emergency Economic Powers Act authority beyond any recognizable constitutional limit. Trump suspended Mexican tariffs after a phone call with President Sheinbaum, then reimposed automotive tariffs on March 4th, then granted USMCA exemptions on March 6th, then threatened 30% tariffs in July, then delayed them for 90 days, then threatened them again. Each reversal, each threat, each impulsive announcement eroded not just Mexico's patience but the fundamental trust required for billion-dollar manufacturing commitments. The North American Manufacturing Integration Agreement represented 5 years of quiet diplomacy under both the Biden and early Trump administrations. It wasn't a trade deal in the conventional sense, it was an industrial strategy. Under its terms, U.S. companies would commit $340 billion in Mexican manufacturing facilities. Mexico would guarantee labor standards, environmental protections, and supply chain transparency that would make nearshoring from China economically irresistible. The framework included binding dispute resolution, intellectual property protections, and workforce development programs that would create an estimated 2 million jobs across both countries over 10 years. Goldman Sachs analysts had valued the agreement's economic impact at $940 billion when measuring its full 15-year implementation cycle, direct investment, supply chain integration, and multiplier effects through both economies. Ford, General Motors, Intel, and over 200 other major U.S. corporations had signed preliminary commitments. The framework was scheduled for formal signing on February 15th. It will never be signed now. Mexico's foreign secretary announced the withdrawal at 3 a.m. Eastern Time on January 21st. The statement was diplomatically worded but devastating in its implications. Mexico cited fundamental uncertainty regarding the United States' commitment to rules-based trade frameworks and good faith partnership. In private conversations that have since leaked to Reuters, Mexican officials used far blunter language. They described Trump's tariff policy as economic terrorism and said they could no longer justify asking Mexican and international investors to commit hundreds of billions to a partnership with a country whose president treats binding agreements as suggestions. Here's the first layer of crisis that most coverage is missing: the constitutional dimension. Trump has invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a statute designed for genuine national emergencies like terrorist financing or weapons proliferation, to impose tariffs based on everything from fentanyl to Greenland to what he perceives as unfair trade practices. Legal scholars across the political spectrum are now warning that this represents an end run around Congress's constitutional authority over commerce. Georgetown law professor Rosa Brooks, who served in both Democratic and Republican administrations, wrote in a blistering Georgetown Law Journal article published this week that Trump's IEEPA usage obliterates the separation of powers by allowing the president to declare economic emergencies based on any perceived threat, real or imagined, and then use that declaration to impose what are effectively taxes, tariffs, without congressional approval. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on this exact question in the consolidated case Learning Resources versus Trump just last week. A ruling is expected within days. If the court strikes down Trump's tariff authority, it won't just invalidate current tariffs. It will confirm what constitutional lawyers have been warning about for months: that Trump has been operating outside legal boundaries, imposing economic policy through executive fiat that the Constitution reserves for the legislative branch. Every trade agreement negotiated under the threat of these tariffs becomes legally dubious. Every corporate decision made in response to these policies carries legal and financial risk. The constitutional crisis isn't theoretical, it's unfolding in real time, and it's destroying America's credibility as a reliable economic partner. The second layer is the economic mechanism that's triggering this market panic, and it's worth understanding in detail because the consequences will affect millions of American families who have no idea this crisis is building. Modern manufacturing doesn't work the way it did when many of our viewers entered the workforce. A car assembled in Detroit might have its engine cast in Indiana, machined in Mexico, fitted with electronics from Texas using components from Mexico and Canada, then shipped back across borders multiple times during production. This isn't inefficiency, this is optimization. It's how you produce a $35,000 vehicle that would cost $65,000 if every component had to be manufactured, start to finish in one country with one country's labor costs and regulatory environment. The North American Manufacturing Integration Agreement was designed to lock this system into place with legal certainty. It would have guaranteed that parts crossing borders for assembly wouldn't face tariffs, that regulatory standards would be harmonized, that workforce training programs in Mexico would meet U.S. industry standards, that intellectual property developed in cross-border partnerships would be protected under both legal systems. Without this framework, every cross-border shipment becomes a gamble. Will tariffs be 2%, 5%, or 25%? Will USMCA exemptions hold, or will they be revoked in a midnight tweet? Ford projected that uncertainty alone would cost them $5 billion in reduced earnings. GM warned investors that they might need to fundamentally restructure their North American operations. This isn't about trade policy anymore. This is about whether you can run a modern manufacturing company when the basic rules of commerce change weekly based on presidential mood. The third layer is what's happening right now in boardrooms across America and Mexico, and it's far more damaging than the immediate market losses. Corporate executives make decisions based on 10-year planning horizons, not quarterly earnings calls. When they commit to building a $2 billion semiconductor fabrication plant or a $500 million automotive assembly facility, they need to know what the regulatory and trade environment will look like not just next year, but in 2030 and 2035. You cannot make those commitments in an environment where tariffs fluctuate based on whether the president is angry about border policy or Greenland or whatever grievance dominates his attention span that week. Multiple sources at Fortune 500 companies have told the Wall Street Journal that Mexico deal withdrawal is triggering emergency strategy sessions. Intel was planning 8. $5 billion in Mexican chip manufacturing under the framework. That investment is now on indefinite hold. Texas Instruments had committed $4 billion to expand their Mexican facilities. That expansion is being reconsidered. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. Intel's planned facilities would have directly employed 12,000 workers in Mexico and supported 40,000 supply chain jobs across North America, including thousands of high-skill engineering positions in Arizona, California, and Texas. Those jobs aren't being created now. The semiconductor manufacturing capacity those facilities would have provided isn't being built. And here's what makes this particularly devastating. China is watching. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's most advanced chipmaker, was reportedly considering Mexican facilities as part of the framework agreement. They've now announced they're focusing exclusively on expansions in Europe and Southeast Asia. The U.S. just lost a generational opportunity to secure advanced semiconductor manufacturing in our hemisphere because our president couldn't maintain consistent policy for 60 consecutive days. The fourth layer is the precedent this sets for every other country negotiating with the United States, and the implications are genuinely terrifying if you understand how international economic architecture actually functions. The European Union is watching Mexico walk away from a $940 billion commitment because they can't trust American consistency. Japan is watching. South Korea is watching. Every country that we need as a partner in competing with China's economic influence is learning the same lesson. Agreements with Trump's America aren't worth the paper they're printed on because they'll be renegotiated or discarded the moment they become politically inconvenient. The Brookings Institution published an analysis yesterday that should be required reading in every newsroom in America. It documents how U.S. trade negotiation outcomes have deteriorated since Trump's second inauguration. Countries that used to accept U.S. terms because they trusted our commitment to long-term partnership are now demanding escape clauses, shorter agreement terms, and independent arbitration. They're treating America like an unreliable partner because we've become one. This isn't about whether you support free trade or protectionism. This is about whether the United States can function as a credible actor in the global economy. Real people are already paying the price, and the stories emerging from border communities reveal the human cost of this executive chaos. Thor Salayandia runs an auto parts factory in Juarez that employs 340 workers making metal tubing components for Ford and GM assembly plants in Texas. He told Al Jazeera that he's beginning layoff procedures because the tariff uncertainty makes it impossible to commit to supply contracts more than 60 days out. His workers aren't abstract statistics. They're families who moved to Juarez for manufacturing jobs that were supposed to represent the future of North American economic integration. Now they're facing unemployment because a president 200 miles away can't maintain consistent policy. Multiply Salayandia's story by thousands. The Border Trade Alliance estimates that 37,000 manufacturing jobs directly tied to cross-border supply chains are now at risk across Texas, Arizona, California, and New Mexico. These are American jobs. These are workers in El Paso and San Diego and Tucson who depend on the integrated supply chains that Trump's tariff chaos is destroying. The White House keeps claiming these policies will bring manufacturing back to America, but the data shows the opposite. The Institute for Supply Management reports that U.S. manufacturing activity has contracted for 9 consecutive months due to the economic uncertainty these tariffs create. You cannot reshore manufacturing when companies can't predict what their input costs will be next quarter. The fifth layer, and this is the one that should genuinely frighten anyone concerned about American power and influence, is what this does to our competition with China. The entire strategic logic of nearshoring, of building integrated supply chains with Mexico and Canada, was to create an economic bloc in our hemisphere that could compete with China's manufacturing dominance. That was bipartisan consensus. That was sound strategy. Mexico's low labor costs combined with U.S. technology and capital, protected by USMCA trade rules, and now this broader manufacturing framework would make it economically attractive to produce in North America rather than ship from Shanghai. China is watching this framework collapse with barely concealed satisfaction. They've already increased foreign direct investment in Mexico by 340% since 2023, specifically targeting companies that want access to North American markets without the uncertainty of US policy. Chinese EV manufacturer BYD now controls 30% of Mexico's auto market. Chinese electronics manufacturers are building facilities in Tijuana and Monterrey. This was supposed to be prevented by the Manufacturing Integration Agreement, which included specific provisions to limit Chinese participation in sensitive sectors. That protection is gone now. Mexico will pursue Chinese investment because they need it, and they've learned they can't count on stable US partnership. The consequences of this will take years to fully manifest, but they're already becoming visible if you know where to look. Baker Institute research shows Mexico's pivot toward Chinese capital has accelerated dramatically in the 6 months since Trump's tariff chaos began. Factories producing consumer electronics, furniture, and textiles with Chinese investment are proliferating in Mexico precisely because these companies know they can export to the US at lower tariffs than direct imports from China, even with the current tariff uncertainty. We're not blocking Chinese economic influence. We're just making it slightly more expensive while destroying our own partnerships in the process. Every expert who understands trade policy has been screaming these warnings into the void. Former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner, who typically focuses on constitutional law rather than trade, has called Trump's use of IEEPA authority a constitutional abuse that future presidents will cite as precedent for executive overreach in areas far beyond trade. Trade economists at MIT have published models showing that Trump's tariff policies will cost the median American household between $1,000 and $1,300 annually by the end of 2026 through higher consumer prices. Goldman Sachs research demonstrates that 82% of tariff costs are being absorbed by U.S. companies and consumers, not foreign exporters as Trump claims. The unemployment data tells the story the White House refuses to acknowledge. Job creation averaged 49,000 per month in 2025, compared to 168,000 monthly under Biden's final year. Unemployment has reached a 4-year high. Manufacturing jobs, the sector Trump claims these tariffs will revive, have declined in 9 consecutive months according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. The promised reshoring isn't happening. The jobs aren't being created. The only measurable effects are higher costs for American families and the destruction of partnerships that took decades to build. But the market reaction over the past 48 hours suggests that investors have finally grasped what trade economists have been warning about for months. This isn't sustainable. You cannot run the world's largest economy on presidential whim. You cannot maintain manufacturing supply chains when trade rules change based on cable news coverage. You cannot ask companies to invest billions in long-term infrastructure when the regulatory environment might be completely different in 60 days. The $80 billion market loss in a single session is investors screaming that they've lost confidence in American economic governance. This wasn't a normal market correction based on profit warnings or economic data. This was a flight from US assets, because the President of the United States has proven repeatedly that he will sacrifice long-term economic partnerships for short-term political theater. That $80 billion represents real retirement accounts, real pension funds, real investments that millions of Americans depend on. It's gone because this president cannot maintain consistent policy. Here's what happens next, and none of it is good. The Supreme Court could strike down Trump's tariff authority in the learning resources case, which would invalidate months of trade policy and create legal chaos for every company that made decisions based on those tariffs. Or the court could uphold Trump's authority, which establishes precedent for future presidents to use emergency powers to bypass Congress on virtually any economic policy they can frame as a security threat. Either outcome damages constitutional governance and economic stability. Mexico will pursue the Chinese investment partnerships they've been negotiating since the framework talks collapsed. BYD is reportedly planning $6 billion in Mexican EV manufacturing facilities. Chinese semiconductor companies are in advanced discussions about fabrication plants in Mexico that would specifically target the USMCA market, access the Manufacturing Integration Agreement was designed to protect. The US won't block these investments because we don't have the leverage anymore. Mexico learned that partnership with America under Trump means uncertainty, chaos, and betrayal of commitments. The European Union, watching Mexico walk away from a $940 billion framework, is already restructuring its trade negotiations with the US to include shorter terms and more escape clauses. They're treating us like an unreliable partner because Trump's actions have made us one. Every country we need as an ally in economic competition with China is learning the same lesson. This isn't just about tariffs or trade deals. This is about whether the United States can function as a credible actor on the world stage when executive power is wielded without constraint, without consistency, and without regard for long-term consequences. The framers of the Constitution understood that unchecked executive authority was among the gravest threats to democratic governance. They built separation of powers specifically to prevent what we're witnessing now. A president using emergency authorities to impose economic policy that Congress never authorized, threatening and then walking back major diplomatic commitments based on political mood, destroying partnerships that took generations to build. Glenn Kirshner captured the stakes in his latest legal analysis video. What we're seeing isn't just bad trade policy. We're seeing the systematic dismantling of the constitutional guardrails that prevent autocratic governance. When a president can declare emergencies at will, impose what are effectively taxes without congressional approval, and then reverse those policies based on political calculation rather than legal process, we're not operating under the rule of law anymore. We're operating under the rule of one man's impulses. The historical comparison that keeps surfacing in conversations with constitutional scholars is Nixon's use of executive authority to impose wage and price controls in 1971 without congressional authorization. Those controls were eventually ruled unconstitutional, but the damage to economic stability and institutional trust lasted years. We're watching a similar dynamic unfold in real time, except the stakes are far higher, because we're not just talking about domestic price controls. We're talking about the architecture of international trade that supports millions of American jobs and trillions in economic activity. Mexico's withdrawal from this framework agreement will echo for decades. It signals to every other country that long-term commitments with the United States aren't worth making because they'll be undermined the moment they become politically inconvenient. It hands China an enormous strategic victory in the competition for economic influence in our own hemisphere. It eliminates hundreds of thousands of potential jobs in both countries. It increases consumer costs for American families. And it confirms that this administration values political theater over economic stability. The $80 billion that evaporated from Wall Street in overnight trading and Tuesday's session represents just the immediate shock. The real cost will be measured in lost opportunities, foregone investments, and the partnerships we'll never build because we've proven ourselves unreliable. Companies that would have committed billions to North American manufacturing will instead invest in Southeast Asia or Europe. Supply chains that could have been secured in our hemisphere will remain dependent on China. Workers who could have had stable manufacturing careers will face unemployment or lower-wage service sector jobs. This is what happens when you treat the global economy like a reality television negotiation. This is what happens when you grant emergency powers to a president who views consistency as weakness and compromise as surrender. This is what happens when constitutional guardrails are ignored, when Congress abdicates its responsibility to check executive overreach, when the rule of law becomes subordinate to presidential impulse. The question before us now isn't whether these policies are good or bad for specific industries or voting blocs. The question is whether we're going to allow executive authority to operate without constitutional constraint, whether we're going to accept that trade policy can change weekly based on presidential mood, whether we're willing to sacrifice long-term economic stability for short-term political gestures. Mexico made their answer clear. They walked away from $940 billion because they concluded that partnership with Trump's America isn't worth the risk. The market made its answer clear with $80 billion in losses in a single day. Investors have lost confidence in American economic governance. The only question that remains is how much more damage will be done before this constitutional crisis is addressed. How many more partnerships will collapse? How many more jobs will be lost? How many more billions will evaporate from retirement accounts? How much more credibility will America sacrifice on the altar of executive ego? We will continue tracking developments. Subscribe for fact-based analysis. This story is far from over.